Hello and welcome to another edition of Luminar Coffee Break. I'm your host, Vanelli. Now, our topic today is digital noise. What causes it and how do we fix it? All right, so let's dive right in and let me show you a couple examples that I have. Now, digital noise typically appears in the shadows, and it's usually caused when you're using a higher ISO. Well, that's partially true. All right. So a lot of people associate digital noise, which is that grain, and I'll show you that in a second, like the graininess of the image. It's typically associated with high ISO. Well, let's use this image of Erica for a moment. Look down here. Wait till it regenerates. 2,800 ISO. So this was shot in a Florida sunset, in a Florida direct sun. Let's see, at 1,300 hours, so that's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We shot this image for a tutorial. Now, if you look down again, it's shot at 2,800 ISO. That's outrageous. All right, so that is a huge number. Now, why did I set it at 2,800 when I'm shooting f8 at 1,250th of a second? You want the truth? My eyes must not be as good as they used to be because I thought it was 280 ISO, which is very feasible and doable. But look at this. This was shot with the new Nikon Z camera, Z2. Here we are. Look at this. I'm zooming in. What are we at? Let's go to 200. Let's go to 100%. Notice you don't see that much digital noise. All right, let's give it a second to render. So why aren't we seeing noise if it's 2,800? Why aren't we seeing it in this beautifully lit daytime photo? And that's because the digital noise lives in the shadows. In order for it to increase the ISO, it's amplifying the image. And when it amplifies the image, typically in the darker areas of the image is where you'll see noise. All right? So 2,800 ISO, I don't think I could have shot that. Well, if I shot 2,800 ISO with my older gear, we're talking the D200, the D300, 10 years ago, if we shot this in a poorly lit environment, you'd see that noise all day long. So in broad daylight, you don't notice it because, again, ISO adds to digital noise, but it's also the lighting. So let's look at Lewis here. All right, we all know Lewis here is a good-looking kid. Look here. We'll get a little bit close. I'm going to go to 100. All right, now let's look very close. Ready for this? Look down at the info. 12,800 ISO. Holy crap. All right, can you believe that? 12,800 ISO. Look at the digital noise. But I mean, where is it? Well, let me show you. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to uncheck the denoise tool. Now you can see the digital noise. But look at that. Notice it wasn't bad when we photographed it with direct sunlight, with lots of light. Digital noise, once again, is going to rear its ugly head in the shadows, right in here. All right, let me move up a little bit. Yep, you see it? Now, in the old days, how do we fix it? We convert this to a black and white image because black and whites thrive on digital noise. In fact, we even have a film, let's see, under the creative, we even have a film grain tool to kind of simulate or add some of this noise back in. But look at this noise. That's unacceptable. So that's unacceptable if I shot it with my D810. So my D810 is a 32 megapixel camera. This noise at 12,800 would have been unusable. So we have the noise. I'm going to come over here to our denoise tool, and I'm going to look for the luminosity for denoising. So I'm going to take the brightest pixels here, and I'm going to fix the noise in those areas. I'm going to click on Advanced, and if you notice Boost, what Boost is going to do in a case like this is it's going to look for the finer details in that noise and fix them. If you ever wonder what each one of these sliders do, click on Help, and then from Help, click on User Guide. Let's pull up the user guide for a moment, and we're going to type in denoise. So here we are with the denoise tool, and the luminosity denoise, the slider removes the grayscale noise from the image. Color noise removes the color. So you'll notice every so often you'll see different artifacts with color noise, usually reds, blues, just different colors, and you can definitely tell it's color noise. Now the boost slider is going to increase the aggressiveness, and it's going to pinpoint and go after the finer details of the denoise. So think of boost as just that you took the denoise tool almost past its limit. Now you're going to come in with the boost tool, and you let boost really go after it. If you go too much, the problem is, and let it render, it's going to remove the clarity in the person's face or in the different areas of the image itself. So again, noise happens, with the camera digital, it's amplifying the image or the ISO. So ISO is amplifying the images, and in order for it to get this area lit properly, it has to do something with it, and it's amplifying it, causing the digital noise. So again, that's something to look into when you're shooting. Try the best you can, and I'll show you that in a second, to lower that ISO. Now, Gary brought out a good point. Yeah, look, let's look into his eyes. Give it a second. And look, now that's increased 220%. Now you can definitely see the digital noise, all right? So in an image like this, look at that. That is a beautiful shot. We'll do before and after. Here's before. Here's after. You can't really see the noise unless you zoom in on it, but if we were to print this as an 8x10, you're not going to notice it. 16x20, yeah, you'll start to notice it. Anything bigger than a 16 by, let's say a 2 foot by 3 foot, you're definitely going to see that digital noise in the scene. So a couple ways to avoid this. One, try not to shoot at 12,800 for your noise or for your ISO. So how do we avoid that? Well, in a situation, let me pull it up here, with this, for this shot of Lewis, I shot at 500th of a second. Well, why 500th of a second? It was handhold, and I knew I could comfortably hold an 85mm lens at 500th of a second. Not a problem. So if we brought that down to 250th of a second, so if I cut this in half, so from 500, one stop less is 250th of a second, that would be that 12,800 could drop down to 6,400 ISO. Okay, well now it's at 250th of a second. If I were to drop that down again to 125th of a second, that's another full stop. Notice I'm just doubling the shutter speed. So from 500, we cut it in half, which was 250, cut that in half, 125. Now that's 6,400. I could drop it down to 3200 ISO. And with 3200 ISO at 5.6, that's going to look pretty good. Now, I shot at 5.6, even though this lens can go to a 1.4. I did this for a teaching tool. 5.6 is what most kit lenses go to. If I drop that 5.6 down even further, let's say to 2.8, because that's half again, now that 1600 ISO would be dropped down to 800. So do you see how I'm doing the math here? I wish I had a little chart to show you. I could fix digital noise in camera if I didn't shoot 500th of a shutter speed and I didn't shoot 5.6. I could have brought that digital noise down. Now, let's say that's the lowest I can shoot. Now it's where you get a tripod. And when you put it on a tripod, you have the image on a tripod. I can snap it. I can lower that shutter even lower because I'm not worried about camera shake. Now, personally, for a portrait, now that's for landscape. For a portrait, we'd have to introduce light. Whether it's artificial light with a flash, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, grab a diffuser. And let me put this up here. And all a diffuser is, there we go. And all a diffuser is, or a reflector rather, is think of the, in your car where you open up the sun visors. So they have a reflector that's round typically, and it's called a 5-in-1. And we did a feature on this a few weeks back. You could use that to reflect light back into the subject. So where Lewis was positioned in this shot here, we had somebody off to the side, because you can see in his eye, there's a little light. We had somebody pushing light back onto Lewis. If it wasn't enough, which it isn't here, then we could introduce a flash to get that. If this were a landscape, put it on a tripod, do a long shutter release, boom, but you have to worry about things swaying, in the wind. So we know what causes digital noise. Now we have the tools to help combat it or help to fix it. All right? So let me grab some of the questions here. Good. Yes, Jerry, it was a super high shutter speed. We can easily bring that down. Russell knows it was a new camera, but again, that's not the reason. Expensive lenses will help you lower that f-stop. Yes, he does look very distinguished. And in the film world, rain or noise would have been global. Well, yes and no. All right. So he's saying, my buddy Jerry here is saying that in the film world, the noise. So, I'm trying to make sure I word it properly. In the film days, it's how sensitive the sensor was to the light, or the film is to the light. So in the digital world, they made it to where that film is sensitive to the light. So you're correct. The whole area would have been noisy, but not nearly as bad as in the shadows. Digital comes along, and it's not how sensitive the sensor is. Now it's the amplification. How much does the sensor have to amplify the signal, the image, the digital image, to bring out the exposure? So when it amplifies it and cranks it up, that's where you get the noise. A good friend of ours, Carl, brought out a typical engineer, brought out a really good analogy and said, think when you're listening to your stereo in your car and you're on Bluetooth, if you put your phone at 100% and you just lightly dial in the volume on the stereo, you're going to hear distortion because the phone is at 100%. Drop the phone down to 80 and then crank up the music and make it a little bit louder at the bass. You're not going to hear the distortion nearly as bad. That's the same thing with digital noise. We want to make sure that we're not pushing the sensor too far, but we're able to get the shot. So now, back in the old days, that shot would have been possible. 12,800 ISO. You would have looked at this area and said, you know what, either we bring in a bunch of lights or forget it, move on to another section. So it's really cool. Let's see if I can grab a couple of them. Yep, there we go. It's really cool that we can go in an area like this that's poorly lit and just make some great images out of this. Look at this. All of these shots here were done with natural light and using a simple reflector, just bouncing light back on to the subject. So there we have it. I hope that helped with digital noise to where, because I was always taught, no, keep your ISO as low as it can go for your camera settings, or native to your camera. Hold it as low as you can, always shoot there. Well, sometimes you have to bump up that ISO. A really, really talented photographer, Jay Maisel, says that he puts it at 400 ISO, which he calls it ASA, the old-fashioned film days. He puts it in 400 ISO, and he goes roaming the streets of New York City doing street photography because he feels no matter what, at 400 ISO, he's going to get a really good shot. This concept here, I like 100 ISO. I like the lowest setting. I'll use ISO only when it's a last resort. All right? So I hope that helped you. And Andrea, hell, welcome from Italy. Glad to have you with us here. So if there's any other questions, great. So check it out. Take your camera out in just, let's say, photograph a bunch of flowers in broad daylight. So photograph it, broad daylight, crank up your ISO, and just take a shot at, let's say, 200. Put it in, excuse me. Let's say you put it in aperture priority, set it to 200, take a picture. Move the ISO up to 400, take another picture. Move it up to 800, take another picture. And just keep moving it up to where you can go as high as you can. And then bring it into your computer and look to see what your camera does at that ISO in broad sunlight, where you have a lot of the shadows and all that being filled. Then do the same thing when the light goes down and see what happens in the shadow. Once you start to get the hang of that and realize, so this is how far I could push my camera. You'll know that, let's say, when you're at your children's recital and they're up on stage, they're lit with stage lights that look like there's a lot of light, but in reality there isn't. You may have to shoot at 1600 ISO to get them moving to where they're not in motion blur. Or you may look at that and say, oh man, if I shoot this at 6400, my camera can't handle it. It's a waste of time, unless you want them as reference photos. So learn to see what your camera can do. And then once you understand the limits, or the strengths, I should say, the strengths of your camera, then go for it and take those shots. All right? Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Or if you have ideas for future shows, let us know. Well, I'm Fidelli, and I'll see you at the next coffee break.